China just made a choice, and that choice could decide whether Ukraine survives the next 6 months. Here's what nobody's telling you. While European leaders are celebrating what they're calling breakthrough security guarantees for Ukraine, while Trump is meeting with Russian oligarchs in Miami, while the entire Western world is focused on peace talks that may or may not happen, there's a third player in this war, a player that's been operating in the shadows, a player that's keeping Russia's war machine running. And that player is about to become the most important country in this entire conflict, China, the silent partner, the economic lifeline, the reason Russia hasn't collapsed yet. And right now, as we speak, there are negotiations happening behind closed doors about whether China will continue backing Moscow or whether Beijing will finally step back. And the answer to that question, the answer we don't have yet, will determine everything. Whether Ukraine gets the security guarantees it needs, whether Russia runs out of resources, whether this war ends in 2025 or drags on for another decade. Let me be very clear about something. This war is not just about missiles and tanks anymore. It's about money. It's about technology. It's about supply chains. And China controls all three. Every time Russia fires a missile into Kyiv, there's a Chinese component in that system. Every time Russian soldiers advance with new equipment, there's Chinese manufacturing behind it. Every time Putin stands at a podium and says Russia's economy is fine despite sanctions, he's not lying, because China is buying Russian oil and gas at rates that keep the Kremlin flush with cash. Western intelligence officials will tell you off the record that China is providing more than just dual-use technology. They're providing actual military aid. Beijing denies it. They'll keep denying it. But the evidence is overwhelming. And it's been that way since the beginning. So here's the question that should be keeping everyone awake at night. Can Trump cut a deal with Xi Jinping that gets China to pull back? And if he can, what would that even look like? Because think about the implications. If China stops supporting Russia, the war ends. Not immediately, but inevitably. Russia's economy craters. Their supply lines dry up. Their ability to sustain offensive operations collapses. Ukraine doesn't have to win militarily. Russia just has to lose economically. But if China keeps backing Russia, then all these peace talks in Berlin and Miami are meaningless. All these security guarantees Europe is promising are worthless, because Russia will have the resources to keep fighting indefinitely, and Ukraine will be ground down slowly, relentlessly, until there's nothing left to defend. That's the real calculus here, not whether NATO sends troops, not whether Trump forces Zelensky to give up territory, but whether China decides this war is still worth it. And right now, Beijing is watching very carefully. They're watching how Trump handles negotiations. They're watching how Europe responds. They're watching whether the West has the stomach for a long fight. And they're making calculations about what serves Chinese interests best. Do they keep backing Russia and position themselves as the leader of an anti-Western bloc? Or do they step back, let Russia weaken, and position themselves as the neutral power broker who can deal with everyone? Those are the two options. And Xi Jinping hasn't decided yet. Or if he has, he hasn't told anyone. But here's what we do know. China is not acting out of loyalty to Putin. They're acting out of strategic self-interest. And if Trump can offer China something they want more than a weakened Russia, Beijing will flip. The question is, what does China want that America is willing to give? That's where this gets complicated. Because China wants a lot. They want control over Taiwan. They want dominance in the South China Sea. They want to win the race for artificial intelligence. They want to replace the United States as the world's leading superpower. So what exactly is Trump going to trade to get China to abandon Russia? And is that trade worth it? We're about to find out. Because the next few weeks are critical. Talks are happening in Miami right now between Trump's envoys and Russian officials. And you can bet that parallel conversations are happening with Beijing, conversations we're not hearing about, conversations that will shape the next decade. This is the story everyone's missing, the story that's not about missiles or territory or security guarantees. It's about economics. It's about alliances. It's about whether the most powerful country on earth can convince the second most powerful country to stop propping up the third. And if you think that's not the most important geopolitical question of 2025, you're not paying attention. Let me walk you through exactly how deep China's involvement in this war actually goes, because this isn't some vague partnership. This is a full-scale economic and military relationship that's keeping Russia in the fight. Start with the oil. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter, and China is buying massive quantities of it. We're talking billions of dollars every month flowing into Moscow's coffers. And they're not paying market rates. They're paying discounted rates because Russia is desperate for buyers. But even at a discount, it's enough to keep the Russian economy afloat. Western sanctions were supposed to cripple Russia's energy revenues, and they did for a while. European countries stopped buying Russian gas. The United States banned Russian oil imports. The idea was to strangle Putin's war chest and force him to the negotiating table. But China stepped in, and not just China. India, too. And a bunch of other countries that decided Western sanctions weren't their problem. So instead of Russia's economy collapsing, it stabilized. Not thriving, but stable enough to keep the war machine running. And it's not just oil. China is also supplying technology, semiconductors, electronics, components that Russia can't manufacture domestically because they don't have the industrial capacity, and Western companies won't sell to them. These aren't officially military goods. Beijing is very careful about that. They call them dual-use items, meaning they can be used for civilian purposes or military purposes. A semiconductor can go into a washing machine, or it can go into a missile guidance system. And once it's in Russia, Beijing has no control over where it ends up, except that's not true. They know exactly where it's going. Western intelligence has been tracking this for years, and they've been raising alarms with Beijing saying, you need to stop. And Beijing says, we're not doing anything wrong. These are commercial transactions. But here's the thing. When you're selling billions of dollars worth of dual-use technology to a country actively engaged in a war of aggression, you're not a neutral party. You're a participant. You're enabling the war, and China knows that. So why are they doing it? Why risk international condemnation and potential sanctions to keep Russia propped up? 3 reasons: strategic alignment, economic opportunity, and ideological solidarity. Let's start with strategy. China views the United States as its primary rival, and anything that weakens American influence globally is good for China. The war in Ukraine has distracted Washington. It's drained American resources. It's divided NATO. And it's created an opening for China to expand its own influence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. If Russia collapses, that's bad for China because it means the United States wins. It means NATO is emboldened. It means Western democratic values are validated, and it means China is more isolated. But if Russia survives, even in a weakened state, it means the West failed. It means authoritarian regimes can challenge the international order and get away with it. And it means China has a partner, however flawed, in pushing back against American dominance. Now let's talk economics. Russia is desperate, and desperate countries make great trade partners if you're the one with leverage. China is getting Russian oil at bargain prices. They're gaining access to Russian natural resources. They're securing long-term energy contracts that will benefit them for decades. This is colonialism without the label. Russia is becoming economically dependent on China in ways that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. And Beijing is fine with that, because a dependent Russia is a controllable Russia. And finally, ideology. Both China and Russia are authoritarian states. Both are led by strongmen who've consolidated power and eliminated opposition. Both view liberal democracy as a threat to their rule. And both benefit from a world where borders can be redrawn by force and international law is optional. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin share a worldview. They may not be true allies in the sense that they'd go to war for each other, but they're aligned in wanting to see American power diminished and a multipolar world where might makes right. So when people ask, why won't China speak up for Ukraine? The answer is simple. Because China doesn't want Ukraine to win. They want this war to continue just long enough to weaken both Russia and the West without collapsing global stability so much that it hurts Chinese economic growth. It's a balancing act. And so far, Beijing has walked that line perfectly. Now, here's where Trump comes in. And this is where things get really interesting, because Trump thinks he can flip China. He thinks he can offer Xi Jinping something valuable enough that Beijing will pull back support for Russia and let the war end on terms favorable to the West. Is he right? Maybe. Trump does have leverage. He controls access to the American market. He can impose tariffs. He can restrict technology exports. He can make life very difficult for Chinese companies. And Xi knows that. But here's the problem. China also has leverage. They're America's largest trading partner. They manufacture a huge percentage of the goods Americans buy. They hold over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. And they have their own economic weapons they can deploy if Trump pushes too hard. So any deal between Washington and Beijing has to be carefully calibrated. Trump can't just demand that China abandon Russia and expect Xi to comply. He has to offer something in return. Something big. What could that be? There are a few possibilities. Trump could ease restrictions on Chinese technology companies. He could reduce tariffs on Chinese goods. He could agree not to interfere in the South China Sea. He could even tacitly accept Chinese claims over Taiwan in exchange for Beijing stepping back from Russia. That last one is the nightmare scenario for a lot of people in Washington, because it would mean sacrificing one ally, Taiwan, to save another, Ukraine. And it would signal to every American partner around the world that U.S. commitments are negotiable. But Trump has made it clear he's transactional. He doesn't think in terms of ideology or alliances. He thinks in terms of deals. And if he can get China to stop backing Russia, he'll consider that a win, regardless of what he has to give up. The question is whether Xi will take the deal. And right now, I don't think he will. Here's why. China benefits from the status quo. The war in Ukraine is draining American resources and attention away from Asia. It's strengthening the China-Russia partnership. It's creating opportunities for Beijing to expand its influence globally, and it's not costing China much. Sure, there's some reputational damage. Western countries are criticizing China for enabling Russian aggression, but Beijing doesn't care. They're not trying to win over Western public opinion. They're playing a long game where economic power and military strength matter more than moral authority. So unless Trump offers something truly transformative, something that changes China's strategic calculus in a fundamental way, Xi has no reason to abandon Russia. And even if Trump does offer something big, there's no guarantee Xi will accept, because Xi is also thinking about domestic politics. If he's seen as caving to American pressure, that weakens him at home. And Xi has spent years consolidating power. He's not going to risk that for a deal with Trump. But let's say, hypothetically, Trump does cut a deal. Let's say China agrees to pull back support for Russia in exchange for some major concession. What happens next? Russia's economy starts to collapse. Their ability to sustain the war effort diminishes rapidly. Putin faces a choice. He can either negotiate a settlement while he still has some leverage, or he can double down and hope that Europe and the United States lose interest before Russia runs out of resources. My guess is Putin doubles down, because that's what autocrats do. They don't admit defeat. They escalate. They take bigger risks. They bet that the other side will blink first. And that's where this gets dangerous. Because if Russia is losing economically and militarily, Putin might decide to use his most extreme option, the nuclear option. Not necessarily a full-scale launch, but a tactical nuclear weapon to shock the world into accepting his terms. That's the nightmare scenario. And it's not as far-fetched as people want to believe. So let's talk about what happens if China doesn't pull back, if Beijing decides that supporting Russia is still in their strategic interest. What does that mean for Ukraine and for the West? It means the war continues indefinitely. Russia will keep grinding forward, slowly, taking small amounts of territory, inflicting massive casualties on both sides, and betting that eventually Ukraine runs out of soldiers and the West runs out of patience. And here's the brutal truth. That strategy might work because Ukraine is exhausted. They've been fighting for 3 years. They've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Their economy is in ruins. Their infrastructure is destroyed. And they're entirely dependent on Western aid to keep functioning. If that aid dries up, Ukraine collapses. Not immediately, but within months. And the only thing keeping the aid flowing is political will in Washington and European capitals. And that political will is fragile. In the United States, there's a growing faction that wants to cut off funding for Ukraine. They argue that it's not America's war, that Europe should handle it, that the money could be better spent at home. And Trump has signaled that he's sympathetic to those arguments. In Europe, there's fatigue. Countries are struggling with their own economic problems. Energy prices are high. Inflation is persistent. And voters are asking why their governments are spending billions on a war in Eastern Europe when they're cutting social services at home. So if China keeps backing Russia, the pressure on Ukraine to accept a bad peace deal will become overwhelming. Zelensky will have to choose between giving up territory or watching his country bleed to death. And here's the thing. Even if Ukraine accepts a deal, even if there's a ceasefire and some kind of frozen conflict, Russia wins, because they'll have taken and held Ukrainian territory. They'll have proven that aggression works, and they'll spend the next 5 to 10 years rebuilding their military and preparing for the next invasion. That's the lesson of history. Frozen conflicts don't stay frozen. They thaw. And when they do, the violence comes back worse than before. So the question we should all be asking is not whether there will be peace in Ukraine. The question is, what kind of peace? Is it a peace that secures Ukraine's sovereignty and deters future aggression? Or is it a peace that rewards Russia for invading and sets the stage for the next war? And the answer to that question depends almost entirely on what China decides to do. If China pulls back, Ukraine has a chance. If China doesn't, Ukraine is finished. It's that simple. And right now, all signs point to China staying the course. They're not pulling back. They're not reducing support. If anything, they're deepening their relationship with Russia because they see this as a historic opportunity to reshape the global order in their favor. Xi Jinping is not thinking about 2025. He's thinking about 2050. He's thinking about a world where China is the dominant superpower and the United States is in decline, and keeping Russia in the fight is part of that strategy. So here's where we are. Trump is trying to negotiate a peace deal that depends on conditions Russia won't accept. Europe is trying to provide security guarantees that may not be credible. And China is quietly ensuring that Russia has everything it needs to keep fighting. This is not a recipe for peace. This is a recipe for a long, grinding, devastating war that will reshape Europe and weaken the West for a generation. And the scariest part, most people aren't paying attention. They think the war is winding down. They think negotiations are progressing. They think there's light at the end of the tunnel, but there's not. The tunnel is getting longer and the light is getting dimmer because the most important player in this entire conflict is the one nobody's talking about, China, the silent partner, the economic lifeline, the country that will decide whether Ukraine survives or dies. And right now, they're choosing to let Ukraine die slowly, quietly, while the world watches and does nothing. That's the reality. And unless something changes dramatically in the next few months, that's the future we're headed toward. So what do? Do we pressure China harder? Do we offer them a better deal? Do we accept that we can't control what Beijing decides and focus on making Ukraine as strong as possible for as long as possible? I don't have the answer, but I know this. Pretending China isn't the key to this entire war is delusional. And if we don't figure out how to deal with Beijing, everything else we're doing is pointless. That's the hard truth. And it's time we started facing it.